right. Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit this afternoon. I'll introduce myself. Rudi Schubert. I'm from the IEEE Standards Association. But one of the reasons I wanted to talk about safety and risk, aside from the role IEEE has in standards and safety issues, is the fact that most of my career has actually been in product safety and product performance testing, and that's been like in the communications networks and the power industry as well. So I have some interesting insights. I'm going to try to share a few anecdotes. I think the key takeaway from my talk is really that no matter how safe you think your design is, somebody is out there who's going to do something stupid with it, or they're just going to simply misunderstand how to use a product, and you're going to find risks involved and safety issues that are involved. Sometimes it's not really necessarily the fact that the product is unsafe, but there may be some other characteristics about the product and the way it's used that could actually affect the safety, whether it's in the application, whether it's in a device itself. I think, from some of the few of the examples that I'll give, you just can't rely on people necessarily to be doing the right thing with the products. They can always find a way to somehow misuse it. So for sake of example, the latest technology product that anybody bought, how many people actually read all the safety things that came in the manual? Yeah, I don't see any hands going up. And even if half of you put up your hands, I would say that half of you were probably exaggerating how closely you read it. So there's an implicit assumption that the manufacturer usually has done a very good job, or whoever owns the device, if it's like sort of a back office system, there's an implicit assumption that these things are going to work, because what you really want to see is the cool application and the interesting things that are going to come out of it. You just kind of assume that everything's going to work the way it's supposed to. So some of the challenges that people face and what people face with AR becoming more rapidly out there is adapting for the applications that are out there. There's certainly a litany of different standards that are out there that come to safety. I mean, if you think about the underwriters labs, and OSHA has all kinds of marks around products and their usage, tons of standards, but do they actually apply the way you think they do to AR systems? I mean, some of them could be adapted to it. Some of them are not exactly a direct fit. Is there something more that could actually be done to make things a bit more safe for the users of them? Another thing to think about with products is anticipating and thwarting the unintended consequences. And those, I'll give you a few examples of unintended uses that created issues. But while you're doing that, you also want to have the latitude for innovation. I had done a talk earlier this morning about standards, and one of the things we talked about was the fact that if you do standardization and you do safety standards too early in the process, very often what's going to happen is that you're going to constrict what you're trying to do. So it's a matter of sort of this balancing act of designing products safely while not necessarily making them, taking away from some of the opportunities that you have in designing the devices and the applications. So I'll talk a little bit about product safety experts. Kind of an interesting thing. I gave a talk about 3 weeks ago at an IEEE Product Safety Engineering Society. It's a big group of folks that do, they're very heavily involved with, UL standards, electromagnetic compatibility issues, really looking for things that go wrong on products. What you find is that, there's this army of people out there who, I always say, they're in the back room. They're just trying to find ways to take your cool product and break them. They want to find a way to show that you didn't really think through everything. But what was really interesting about this talk, I was actually focusing on some of the work I had done on smart grid with emerging technologies in the energy grid. And just kind of in passing, I mentioned it's like there's a lot of new technologies coming out like augmented reality. And all of a sudden, all these hands shot up, and they started asking me questions about, what about this, what about that? And it was kind of interesting, because usually these folks are a bit more kind of backroom engineer types who really are thinking about these nuts and bolts things. And now all of a sudden AR is on their radar as well. So that means if AR is on their radar, they're going to start looking at the products that many of you are developing and starting to think again about how they might break them. So a few examples that I'll give from just my past experience in both telecom and energy. For unintended consequences, about 10 or so years ago, actually, well, two stories. 10 or so years ago, was when fiber optic networks started getting deployed more widely. You have Verizon's, the AT&T's putting fiber right straight to your home. And one of the interesting challenges that came up with doing that was multi-story dwellings. So you have high rises and buildings that are basically apartment buildings for the most part. And one of the things that, I think it was Verizon in this case, they were finding, in some of these buildings, they were getting these problems with the signal strength. And there was just issues that they weren't getting, the performance that was expected. And they're studying it, and they can't figure out what the problem is, and they send out technicians. What they were finding is in the basement of some of these buildings, the fiber optic cable would be running, and it would be in the laundry room area, and people were using the fiber optic cables as hangers. They were drying their clothes off of the fiber optic cable. And so all of a sudden you're inducing all this mechanical stress, and sometimes you're inducing thermal and environmental type stresses on them. Now, the people who designed the fiber optic cable were not thinking about their cable being used as a hanger. So, good example of an unintended use and something that goes wrong. Another one, again from my telecom days, there was one neighborhood. It was next to a firehouse. And every day, when the fire whistle would go off at noon, just the noon whistle, the switch would go down. Nobody could figure out why the switch was going down on a regular basis. And they did lots of studies. Everything passed all the right tests. And they eventually, and this took an awful lot of time and money, they figured out that somehow a frequency that was being generated by this whistle was actually resonating with a frequency that was in their main switch. It's just like a freak kind of thing that can happen, but you just never know. In this case, it's an electromagnetic issue. You just don't know what types of signals that an AR device might be exposed to that might actually cause a problem. And certainly that problem, depending on the integrity of the data it's sending, how it's being interpreted, could create a safety problem. That one's a little bit harder to find. I'll give you a third example, and this is actually in the energy space. So, the two examples I gave were just problems that things just weren't used the way they were intended, or was sort of an unintended. You could have a product that's completely safe, and the example I'll give is a smart meter. Maybe some people might disagree, but smart meters, while they were universally deployed, well, I shouldn't say universally, I'll say widely deployed as part of smart grid rollouts that were going on, there was lots of testing. Everybody felt they were perfectly safe. At least all the engineers thought they were perfectly safe. Yet there's a perception issue because there's been a groundswell of, I'll say, conspiracy theorist type folks, who say, oh, these things are being used to monitor what I'm doing in my house, or they're actually emitting lots of electromagnetic energy. And there's been tons of studies that have been done that say that these smart meters are actually putting out less of a signal than your cell phone. People have no problem putting the cell phone to their head, and they don't complain about that. But there's a fear that these smart meters might be creating electromagnetic forces that are somehow causing health issues. And while certainly people are entitled to their opinion on it, none of the actual scientific studies show that these are unsafe. So beyond actual problems, you've also got perception problems. Now, as you start getting more into wearables and smart glasses, I would tend to expect you're going to get people out there who are going to say, this is a dire plot and it's creating a health issue just by wearing them. So even if you've actually done all the studies and done all the product safety analysis, you still can run into this whole perception issue, which can ultimately impact the long-term adoption. It just creates some bumps in the road for folks who are actually hoping that this is going to accelerate quickly. So you kind of have to prepare for some of these ideas and be ready to defend against them. So a couple slides on food for thought. I mentioned earlier there are a number of safety standards that are out there today. Do we have the right safety standards? Are there new standards that might actually need to be developed by some of these safety organizations that are around? Certainly you can try again to squeeze things into a particular standard that's out there, and OSHA may do things. I think really the bottom line when it comes to standards, you want to think about what you might actually need to test and verify early on. You don't want the government coming back afterwards, like with the hi, we're from the government, we're here to help you with your safety problems. You definitely want to do this as a market-driven activity. You don't want to do it as a mandated regulatory activity. So certainly be cognizant that if you feel you need some kind of standard out there or some kind of testing that needs to get done, do it proactively, don't do it reactively. I mentioned the radio interference issue. That can certainly be something that causes a trickle effect, or a ripple effect rather, towards a safety issue. And the last one I had there, when you think about interference designs, so what happens in a mobility situation, you don't necessarily know as you're moving with a device from one place to another what the electromagnetic environment might be, and that could actually cause a performance issue. Performance issue could lead to a safety issue. Just a couple examples. I could give you plenty of anecdotes, but I just wanted to throw a few of these out there. I think I got 2 more slides. Thinking like a risk manager. Unfortunately, we live in a very litigious type society, so you always have to think about the legal aspects. If your product has a problem, the question is always going to come back to, did you really do everything you could have done? Did you really think of everything? Even if something doesn't seem to make an awful lot of sense of like, well, how could I possibly have thought of that? There's always going to be an expectation upon somebody who feels that they've been somehow damaged by a product. There's always feelings like, well, you should have thought of that. So you always have to kind of have that, that risk manager mentality or that legal mentality, thinking, am I covering all my bases the right way? And so for safety, that's why I kind of tie back, is there a standard you can refer to? It's like, did I do everything that is reasonably expected by the community of engineers who look at these things and say, yeah, you did everything that you could foresee. Again, there's going to be unforeseen things that happen, but as much as you can, you want to try to cover your bases. So how standards actually help? There's a lot of standards out there. We talk about safety and risk that are out there. It really goes into a lot of different levels. So I have robustness. So these are like the electrical and mechanical considerations. I mentioned hanging things on a fiber optic cable. There's a lot of mechanical performance issues you can get into, vibration effects. There's even been interesting cases where dust and the combination of dust and humidity can cause hygroscopic-borne problems in products and electronic products. So that's another thing you got to think about, those things which tend to create a safety problem tangentially. They're not a safety problem themselves, they're a performance problem that can show itself as a safety problem. Communications compatibility, as you're looking at how products will interact from, say, one area to another, or different systems interacting with each other, is there an interoperability from a communication standpoint that is also going to prevent a problem from happening? Interchangeability and data semantics interoperability, that's kind of getting a little bit more down in the weeds, but really what it comes down to, besides the fact that I have 2 minutes, I see, and I think I'm on time, really what it comes down to is making sure that the products you have are not so unique that they are going to work with other products, and it's not going to create a safety problem by just some incompatibility between devices and systems. So, the main point, never underestimate a person's capacity to use a product incorrectly. You really have to think about all the crazy things that can happen, because they really do. No matter what you're actually, the focus certainly when it comes to AR devices and where we are right now with the industry is like, hey, there's all these great applications, all these interesting things, but you almost have to think like a little bit more of a big picture of what can possibly go wrong. That's something we don't tend to focus on early on. We're focused on getting a really cool product that lots of people want to buy. I'll kind of leave it with an interesting point. My wife is an industrial hygienist. Those of you in manufacturing will know, like, an industrial hygienist is the safety person, basically, health and safety person. And when I started telling her that I was coming here to give this talk this week, she said, oh, that's kind of interesting. Is any of this stuff safe? That was the first reaction. She was like skeptical about the safety. So if you're if you're an industrial process company, if you have a manufacturing facility, I would suggest talking to your internal health and safety folks. I think they could give you an interesting perspective on what they expect and what they think is a reasonable risk. So again, I'll leave you with, we don't necessarily design for every foreseeable situation, but something out there is going to happen eventually, so as much as you can, try to think about it in advance. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.